We found a photograph of ourselves taken from somewhere deeper in the woods. At first, none of us spoke. The photograph lay on the damp forest floor like something the trees had quietly decided to discard. Eli picked it up. The air around us was cold in that peculiar way forests sometimes become when the sun is still technically out but the canopy has swallowed the light. The clearing we stood in was small, just a depression between thick trunks, their bark blackened by moisture. Pine needles muffled every step. In the photograph, the three of us stood exactly where we were now. Same clearing, same fallen log behind Mara, same crooked white birch leaning like a broken arm. But the angle was wrong. The picture had been taken from behind a wall of trees farther back in the forest, somewhere deeper than we had gone. I remember because the background showed a dark corridor of trunks we had been avoiding since we arrived. It sloped downward into thicker woods where the air looked almost blue with shade. "Who took this?" Mara asked. No one answered. Eli turned the photograph over. Blank. No date, no markings. The paper itself felt oddly cold, like it had been stored in a freezer. "Maybe another hiker," he said, though his voice carried no conviction. There were no other hikers. We hadn't seen a single footprint on the trail since leaving the gravel road 2 hours earlier. Even the ranger station had looked abandoned. The forest was quiet. Not normal quiet, the kind where birds don't call, insects don't hum, and your own breathing feels too loud. Mara stepped closer to me and looked again at the photograph. "Look at the shadows." They were wrong. In the photo, the shadows stretched toward us from deeper in the woods, as if the light source were behind the photographer. But the sun was above us now, and filtered through the canopy. There shouldn't have been any sharp shadows at all. A wind passed through the treetops then, but none of the lower branches moved. Eli laughed nervously and slipped the photograph into his jacket. "Okay," he said. "Creepy souvenir. Let's keep going." "Going where?" I asked. He pointed toward the darker slope. "Down there." I didn't want to admit it, but part of me was curious. The photograph showed something we hadn't seen yet, which meant whoever took it had been there, or something had. We started down the slope. The ground softened under our boots, moss replacing needles. The trees grew taller and closer together, their trunks bending slightly inward like the ribs of some enormous skeleton. The air cooled with every step. Our voices changed too. Echoes came back distorted. When Eli said something, it returned from the woods sounding lower, slower, like someone repeating it after chewing on the words. "Did you hear that?" Mara asked. "Yes," I said, but neither of us said what it sounded like. We walked for another 10 minutes. Then we found the second photograph. It was pinned beneath a stone. The same glossy paper, the same freezing touch. This one showed us standing farther up the slope, just minutes earlier. But again the angle was wrong. This time the photographer stood in a narrow corridor between tightly packed trees we hadn't reached yet. And again the shadows pointed the wrong direction. But something else had changed. In the background of the photo, past the three of us, there was a fourth shape, tall, too thin. It stood between the trees behind Mara. Its limbs looked like branches. His head tilted slightly sideways. At first I thought it was a trick of shadow. Then Eli saw it. "What the hell is that?" Mara stared for a long time. "I don't remember anyone behind us." "There wasn't," I said. We turned slowly and looked back the way we had come. The trees formed a tangled wall of bark and leaves. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. But the silence had deepened. Felt thicker now. Like something listening. Eli forced a laugh again. "Okay," he said. "Someone's messing with us." "With what camera?" Mara asked quietly. None of us had heard a shudder, or footsteps, or anything moving through the brush. The photograph trembled slightly in Eli's hands. Then a sound came from deeper in the forest. A single knock, wood against wood. Not loud, but deliberate. Then another, closer. The trees ahead began to shift. Not swaying, rearranging. Trunks that had stood apart now leaned closer together, narrowing the path. branches interlocked overhead until the sky vanished. We hadn't noticed it happening, but the forest had changed shape around us. Eli pulled the first photograph back out of his pocket. "Look," he whispered. In that first photo, the one from the clearing, the background now showed the same narrow corridor we stood in now. Except, at the far end of it, 3 figures were walking away from the camera. Only smaller, farther ahead, already deeper in the woods. "That's impossible," Mara said. Her breath fogged in the cooling air. Another knock echoed. "This one behind us." We spun. Nothing there. But the trees seemed closer. Their bark glistened like wet skin. A third photograph lay on the ground between our feet. None of us had seen it appear. Eli picked it up slowly. This one showed the corridor we stood in, and us, looking down at the photograph, taken from somewhere farther ahead. Much farther. In the distance behind us, barely visible between the trunks. The tall, thin shape stood again. Closer this time. Its limbs had too many joints, and its head bent at an angle no spine should allow. It wasn't hiding. It was watching. The knock came again. Directly in front of us now. Then the echo returned. But the echo spoke. Not words, just our voices. Fragments of them. Mara's laugh. Eli saying, "Okay." My voice asking, "Going where?" All repeated from different directions. Like the forest had been recording us. Learning the sounds. Another photograph slid silently from the darkness ahead. It stopped against Eli's boot. He stared at it, then slowly handed it to me. My stomach dropped. The picture showed the same corridor, but empty. No us, just the trees, and the tall, thin shape standing in the center of the path, holding something pale in its branch-like hands. A photograph, the one we held now. The knocking stopped. The echoes stopped. Even our breathing felt swallowed. Mara whispered, "It's been watching us the whole time." I shook my head. "No." I pointed deeper into the forest. Because beyond the trees, far ahead, the ground sloped into another clearing. And scattered across its mossy floor were dozens of photographs. Hundreds, maybe, each one catching the faint gray light filtering through the branches. We walked closer without speaking. The pictures showed hikers, campers, families, all standing somewhere in the forest. Each photographed from farther inside. Each moment captured before they reached the place where the camera waited. Mara picked one up. 3 teenagers smiling near a stream. Behind them, barely visible, the same tall, thin shape, watching. Another photo showed a couple sitting by a fire. In the background, a narrow corridor of trees. Waiting. Eli's voice trembled. "It knows where people will go." I nodded slowly. "No," I said again, because the realization had arrived like ice sliding down my spine. "It doesn't know." I looked back down the path behind us. The forest there had closed. The trees stood too tightly together now for us to pass. The corridor was gone. Then I lifted the photograph in my hand. The last one. The one where the creature held a picture. In that image, behind the tall, thin thing, another group of hikers had just entered the clearing. 3 of them, standing where we had stood earlier that day, looking down at something on the ground. A photograph, taken from deeper in the woods. The forest air thickened until it felt like we were walking underwater. At first it was subtle, just a heaviness in the lungs, a damp resistance against every breath, the kind of humidity that presses against your skin and leaves your shirt clinging to your back. But this was different. Humidity moves. Wind shifts it. This stayed. We had been hiking for hours by then, following a narrow trail that wound through an ancient stand of trees older than any map that still bothered to name this forest. The trunks were massive, bark folded into deep ridges like stone worn by centuries of rain. Moss hung from branches in thick curtains, dripping with condensation that never seemed to fall. I noticed the air change first. When I lifted my arm to wipe sweat from my forehead, the motion felt delayed, as though the air resisted it. "Do you feel that?" I asked. Jonah stopped behind me. Feel what? I swung my arm again. It moved slower than it should have, like pushing through water. Mara frowned and waved her hand in front of her face. Okay, that's weird. The forest around us was silent. Not quiet, silent. No insects, no birds, not even the occasional creak of branches rubbing together in the wind. Because there was no wind. The leaves overhead hung perfectly still. But the moss swayed gently, as if responding to currents we couldn't feel. We continued walking. Each step became slightly harder, our boots pressing into soil that felt softer than it had minutes ago. The ground exhaled damp, earthy smells. Wet bark, rotting leaves, something faintly metallic beneath it all. The deeper we went, the thicker the air became. Soon every movement felt deliberate. Breathing took effort. Even sound behaved differently. Jonah cleared his throat, and the noise seemed to stop halfway through the forest, swallowed by the heavy air. Echo, he said experimentally. The word drifted forward, then came back, but wrong. Cho. The return sounded thinner, older somehow, as though something deeper in the forest had tried to repeat it and failed. Mara glanced over her shoulder. Did you hear that? We all had. The trail curved sharply around a cluster of trees. Except when we reached the bend, the trail didn't continue the way we remembered. It forked. Two narrow paths split through the trees. Neither one looked familiar. That's not right, Jonah said. We didn't pass a fork, Mara added. The air pulsed faintly around us. It was the only way I could describe it. A subtle tightening and loosening, like a slow inhale and exhale passing through the forest itself. With each pulse, the humidity thickened for a moment, then relaxed. Maybe we missed it, Jonah said, though he didn't sound convinced. I stepped toward the left path. The air resisted me, not dramatically, but enough that I felt it in my chest, like wading deeper into a lake. Behind us, something shifted. We turned. The path we had come from was gone. Not completely, just altered. The trees had moved closer together. The trail narrowed into a tangle of roots and ferns where moments ago there had been open ground. Okay, Mara whispered. That's not possible. The forest exhaled again. The pressure in the air increased. Breathing grew harder. And with that slow inhale, the shadows stretched. Not longer sideways. They slid across the forest floor in ways that ignored the position of the sun, bending around roots and stones like spilled ink being drawn toward something unseen. Jonah raised his voice. Hello! The sound barely left his mouth. It dissolved into the dense air. A few seconds later, it returned. Hello! But the echo came from behind us. And deeper. Far deeper than the forest should have allowed. We stared at each other. Something moved then. Not through the trees. Through the air. At first it looked like heat distortion. A faint ripple passing between trunks. But the forest was cool, almost cold beneath the thick humidity. The ripple flowed slowly across the path. Where it passed, the moss lifted slightly. Leaves curled inward. And the air grew momentarily thinner, like a pocket where something had displaced it. Did you see that? Mara whispered. Jonah nodded. The ripple paused between two trees. The surrounding air tightened again. Another slow inhale. The forest seemed to draw breath. And suddenly I realized what the movement reminded me of. Not wind, not heat. Breathing. Something enormous inhaling through the spaces between trees. We heard it then. A deep, distant intake of air. Not from a throat. From everywhere. The forest floor vibrated faintly as the air thickened further. Jonah stepped backward. His boot met resistance before touching the ground, as though the atmosphere itself had become dense enough to push against. This place, he said quietly. It's alive. The ripple moved again, faster now, sliding between trunks and branches, bending around us in slow spirals. Where it passed near our bodies, the air pressed inward, squeezing against ribs and lungs. It wasn't attacking. It was examining, testing density, measuring breath. Mara spoke carefully, as though afraid her voice might shatter something delicate. "It's in the air." The ripple paused beside her shoulder. For a moment, the space around her face cleared slightly. Her hair lifted. Then the pressure returned twice as strong. The forest exhaled again. The trees shifted. Not dramatically, just enough that the path ahead curved where it had been straight seconds earlier. We tried to turn back, but every direction now looked subtly wrong. The trees leaned inward at unfamiliar angles. Distances stretched. Light filtered through the canopy in impossible ways, beams bending sideways as though refracted through water. The deeper we walked, the slower we moved. Not by choice. The air simply refused to let us move faster. Our breaths became visible, thin clouds lingering too long before dispersing. The ripple followed us, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, always circling. The echoes began returning before we even spoke. Fragments of footsteps, half-breaths, the faint rasp of fabric, all repeating out of sequence. The forest was learning our sounds. We eventually reached a clearing, or what looked like one. The trees formed a perfect circle around a patch of pale moss. The air inside the circle was thickest of all, almost gelatinous with humidity. Stepping into it felt like pushing through a membrane. Inside, the light dimmed drastically. Yet the sky above remained visible. Jonah tried to shout again. Nothing came out. The air had become too dense to carry his voice. Then the ripple rose in front of us. Not flat anymore. Three-dimensional. A towering distortion of air that twisted upward between the trees like a slow cyclone made of breath itself. Within it, faint shapes moved. Suggestions of limbs, of faces formed briefly in the fogging humidity. Not separate creatures. Impressions, like memories trapped inside exhaled air. Mara's eyes widened. "It's breathing us in." The forest inhaled deeply. The pressure increased so suddenly my ears popped. The ripple expanded outward, surrounding the clearing like a transparent wall. Beyond it, the trees swayed. Not from wind, from the pull of something drawing breath through them. Jonah tried to run. He managed 2 slow steps before the thick air pushed him back, holding him in place like invisible water. We weren't trapped by barriers. We were suspended inside the forest's lungs. And it was breathing, slowly, patiently. Each inhale pulled more air through the clearing. Each exhale returned it thicker, heavier. The ripple drifted closer. As it passed through Jonah's shoulder, he gasped. His breath left his mouth and didn't return. The air absorbed it. The ripple carried it upward. We watched his chest rise again. Slower now. The forest exhaled. Mara whispered, though no sound left her mouth. I understood anyway. It wasn't killing us. It was replacing the air we breathed. Gradually, breath by breath, until what filled our lungs belonged entirely to the forest. The ripple passed through me next. Cold, dense, patient. And as it moved on, I realized something worse. Our footprints in the moss behind us had already begun to fade. Not filling with dirt, not washing away, just dissolving, like shapes pressed briefly into water. The forest inhaled again. The air thickened further, and somewhere deeper among the trees, I thought I heard more footsteps entering the woods.